various organizations, institutions to do particularly this. We calculate emissions. The simple idea being, if we can calculate emissions, we can work on reducing them. If you can't measure it, you can't mitigate it, right? So today I'm going to tell you a very short story. I'm not going into any major scientific anything. I want everyone in this room to understand what climate change is. Today we are standing here talking about net zero. Everywhere we go around, everyone's talking about climate change. But just 5 years back, same room if you're sitting, and I asked, you know what net zero is? You know what climate change is? No one would have put their hands up. Many people wouldn't have even heard of it. Why is that? Why do you think that today this term has reached everywhere? That's what I'm going to show you today in a very, very short story. I understand it's almost lunchtime, so please bear with me for a short period. And if I bore you, apologies. So just my whole presentation is in the form of a timeline. So we're going to start from a period of 130 years ago. There was one scientist named Swataranian. In 1896, he was the first person on Earth to detect that our global temperature was increasing. He was the first scientist who published a paper saying that the temperature is rising. And at that point, nobody believed him. There was no scientist, no government department, nobody around the world believed that anything he was saying was true. Until 86 years ago, in 1938, a scientist called Guy Callender, he released a paper. He went around the world to 147 climate stations and he recorded the temperatures. And from that, he actually showed in a research paper that was published officially that the climate is actually increasing. And this was the first time that all the scientists related to him actually acknowledged that this had scientific evidence. He also mentioned that this could be related to carbon dioxide, but he did not have any proof. Then about 66 years ago, in 1958, Charles David Keeling, another scientist, had developed a new device. Until then, nobody was able to measure CO2 in the atmosphere at all. So he invented a device that could measure CO2, and he recorded daily data. For 5 years, he was recording the information every single day. And with this information, he published a paper which showed that carbon dioxide is increasing and the global temperature is increasing, and he said that this is because of humans burning fossil fuels. Never before in the previous history has this CO2 value been increasing. It has always been stable. So he had said that our fossil fuel use and the coincidence of the time of when the CO2 was increasing was the same as the fossil fuel increase. Post this, 57 years ago, a scientist called Japanese scientist Shukoru Manabe, so he made the first computer model. So all this information that was there from the various studies, he put into a model that could change. So if we changed the increase of CO2, what would happen to the temperature? And that first model, and that model is still used till today, predicted what would happen if we increase the amount of CO2 by burning more fossil fuels. That model is still recognized today as evidence and is still predicting the way that we recognize climate change today. The picture you can see there is him actually winning a Nobel Prize in 2022. So his model was so renowned back in 1967 that he won a Nobel Prize in 2022. Post this, right? It was all scientific evidence, all based on assumptions, based on in paper. The first experiment that actually showed evidence of historical CO2. There was a lot of graphs that we saw today in the morning session about historical CO2. So thousands of years ago. But there was no physical proof for this. So what actually happened, 1985, a group of scientists in the Antarctic took something called an ice core. They drilled deep into the ice for about 2000 meters. and they pulled out this ice core that you can see here in this image. What they found is that every year when the ice was forming and getting solidified, it also trapped little bit air from that year. So they found molecules of air for almost 300,000 years trapped in that ice. So they, in this 2,000 meter deep building, they found for every year samples of air for 150,000 years, and they put down in a research paper what CO2 was there for 150,000 years, and it was the first time that there was scientific evidence for mass among history of what the climate system was for 150,000 years. And today, if we discuss this, no scientist will disagree on this. And from that point onwards, there was a global consensus, meaning every scientist around the world agreed that climate change existed, that it was because of, global warming existed, it was because of increase of CO2, and it was caused by humans burning fossil fuels. So by 36 years ago, that's in 1988, the whole world, every scientist in the whole world agreed that this was happening. So what happened is they decided to form a panel called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Sorry, so the IPCC was formed. It's a group of scientists. They gather every year. They collect data from around the world on global warming and climate change and publish it in the IPCC journal. So from the first journal in 1998, we still have IPCC journals published every year, and if you're looking for a scientific document that is globally recognized for climate change with all the information, IPCC is the main document. It is the holy book of climate change, the report that releases every year. So post this, the scientific community had agreed. Climate change is real, humans are causing it. Now what do we do? So there had to be some action done. In order to do this, all the governments of the world came together and they formed the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's the UN body that deals with climate change. So anytime anyone talks about UNFCCC, it is this body. So what is the UNFCCC? Right? It was established in 1992. It is an agreement between 198 countries to work on fighting climate change. This includes India, right? Majority of the world's governments have agreed and are signed on to this to combat climate change. It is the only one agreement that is environment related, that is globally recognized and globally agreed to work on climate change. The document says that they will work towards preventing dangerous human interference with the climate system. So what they agreed was to have a meeting every year where they will discuss, debate and come up with solutions on how all the governments can work together and combat climate change. So I'm going to show you some examples of certain discussions that actually happened right at the beginning, and how we came to these concepts of net zero and how we are going to fight climate change today. When they looked at emissions, the first thing they saw was, okay, every country has so much emissions. They could easily put that down in a paper and say, okay, who is number one in the world? They are responsible, they should fight it. They should take all the responsibility and they should fight climate change. So here you could see China, USA, India. And that was the first discussion. And everyone in the room did not agree. Definitely China, USA and India did not agree. Saying that, yeah, today we are emitting more, but we have a population that's 10 times that of US. How can you compare India's emissions with US emissions? That's not correct. So then the next topic that they spoke about was what we are calling per capita CO2. That means for one citizen in the country, what is the emission, right? And then the number becomes very different. You see that one Indian citizen's emission is very different from one US citizen's emission. And then the blame or the responsibility to act totally shifted. Then again, USA, Canada, China argued, no, but that's not correct. Climate change has already happened. It's happened in the past. Emissions have already been gone into the atmosphere, and that's why we are here today. So what do we do then? They came to the next discussion. Cumulative CO2. All the emissions from the beginning, adding it all up to today, who is responsible? Who has put all the most number of CO2 into the atmosphere? And they are the person who is responsible. So if you look at this, you see that from history, from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, USA and EU have emitted the most number of carbon and put it into the atmosphere. So these are the discussions that actually happened in these sessions that determine what and how different governments will take decisions to act on climate change. So just to show you the same thing that I showed you of per capita CO2 emissions for different countries cumulative. You can see that USA, Russia, the north part, the top part of the graph is more red. That means there's more emissions. Another topic I want to talk about, I think Tuan had covered this. If India and China are making so many products for the rest of the world, we are making mobile phones, we are making so many gadgets, and we are burning the fossil fuels here. We have people working here, and emissions are coming out of India. Is India responsible for that, or is the country that is purchasing that, or the customer located somewhere else in the world responsible for that? So this discussion came up, and if you can see, if you remove, so from the previous one which I showed you where the emissions are happening, if I change it to who is causing it. So if USA is buying a product that's made in India, see that is the responsibility to the person who is buying it, then you see there's a big difference. There are only few countries that are consuming so much more than the rest of the world and causing so much more emissions than the rest of the world. So the discussion came that they should be the ones that are responsible for acting on climate change. At the same time, the discussion also came up that some people are causing climate change, but the effects of climate change are not necessarily coming to the same people. If we look at what is called vulnerability, or who is the person who will get affected, we see it's actually the opposite. What was previously in the top part of the world is now shifted to the bottom part. So the cause of climate change, or the major centers that are giving out emissions of CO2 that are causing climate change, is very different from the countries that are affected by it. So we spoke about in the first session, Professor had covered about floods and droughts, cyclones that are happening more because of climate change. If we see here, just for reference, with respect to effects of climate change, India is the worst in the world. We will be affected the most among any country in the whole world, and because of our climate vulnerability, we have so many risks related to cyclones, droughts, heat waves, to the agricultural system, to our industrial system, etc. So the discussion came that the countries that are considered responsible for climate change that we have today should support the countries that are being affected by the climate change that we have today, and that today is considered as a discussion on climate equity, climate justice. It's not just about the environmental aspect, but also about the social and justice aspect around climate change. So the next discussion they had is how do we quantify this in a way that we can act. So the discussion came up that we should talk about it in terms of the economic impact. How are these impacts can be quantified all in the form of money, right? So what is the effect to each country's GDP with respect to climate change? So what you can see here is a list of the different zones globally, where the one in red, Asian, is where India is located. Mostly the southeast of Asia. There is a chance, depending on how we act on climate change, that India could lose up to 37% of our GDP. Our GDP increase is now 6%, so 37% is in the minus if we don't act on climate change. The first scenario here is if we act, if we do everything that we are committing to become net zero, to do everything that we act, still there is a loss of 4% of GDP to our country. So even if we act or we don't act, there is still a loss. but if we act, we can reduce it. So what came up post this discussion is the difference between mitigating climate change or reducing the impact versus adapting to climate change, meaning adapting to the ill effect that is going to happen. So adapt to this 4.2, we have to change. What if the sea level rises? There are people living by the coast. There are countries like Maldives which, even if we act completely on climate change, do everything possible to mitigate all the effects of climate change, Maldives is guaranteed going to go under the ocean. Just for reference, for everyone to know, Maldives as a country is no longer going to exist no matter what we do related to climate change. So how do we adapt to that, right? People are living there. There are people whose whole lives, generations are living there. They have to adapt to these things. And similarly, in every field, from agriculture, from people who are fishery communities that are based on the coast, if the sea level rises and their houses go under the ocean, we have to act, we have to support them, right? So the discussion between climate mitigation, which is to reduce the effect of these CO2 emissions on the atmosphere, and the discussion on climate adaptation, which is to adapt the people who are going to get affected already, even if we don't act. These two are parallel discussions that are going on. So post this was the first discussions that happened with all the governments in the world to understand how we are really going to act on this climate change problem that we are in today. The first thing they came up with was something called the Kyoto Protocol. So this is very commonly talked about when we talk about climate change. The Kyoto Protocol was happened in an event, one of the top events, 1997. Right? It was 27 years ago. And 27 years ago, all 198 governments around the world agreed, right, that the responsible countries that I spoke about earlier need to fund the vulnerable countries or the countries that are affected to prevent the effects of climate change from affecting them. So this was agreed, and for the past 27 years, these finances have been traveling from what we will call the responsible or the developed countries to the developing countries. It has supported many activities. If you know, in early 2000s, the wind renewable energy boom was subsidized through funds like this. Why solar is so affordable today is subsidized through funds that are coming internationally through these mechanisms. So they have two main mechanisms that they've set up. One is the international emissions trading, meaning that if one country has a target saying we're going to reduce so much, and another country has a target saying we're going to reduce so much, one country doesn't meet the target, one country goes much beyond and reduces a lot of emissions, that country can sell that extra amount of emissions to this country and get funds to do other activities. So this is basically, they had set up the first form of carbon trading. So we will quantify that we have saved 10,000 tons of carbon because we have done extra effort. Other country will say, okay, that we'll pay you so much for that because we are not able to reduce our emissions. The second one being the clean development mechanism. So that was a mechanism where government to government for projects implementation. So for solar, for example, wind, other projects, they've specifically quantified each project's impact. So much CO2 from this project will be reduced, we will pay you for that project to implement, right? And this set up the first difference between development and sustainable development. And that is the whole objective of all of the climate change related discussions today. We should stop development, we should start sustainable development. Any activity that happens, I'll give you a very small example. Today in India, we need to develop our country. There are many parts of India where communities still don't even have access to electricity. And the cheapest form of getting electricity is coal-based power. But coal-based power is not sustainable. So what is the solution? Instead of putting coal-based power, we put renewable power. But there is a big difference in cost, right? That's why we are not choosing renewable over coal for that particular use. The agreement here is that the countries that are responsible for climate change will pay that extra cost and support in doing sustainable development over development. So this concept is very important in the discussion of climate change. Understanding why we are having these global discussions to become net zero and who is supporting who and how. The next thing, post the Kyoto Protocol, they started to implement these systems, and a lot of these systems work, but they realized that development is still happening, emissions are still rising. If we look at the global emissions, it's still going up. These systems are going, money is flowing, countries are supporting each other, but emissions are still going up. So what can we do? Then they realize that along with having this flow of money, they also need to have actual targets for the countries to reduce the emission. So they set up 3 activities under the next agreement, which is called the Paris Agreement. So in 2015, at one of the COP events, the countries agreed on 3 aspects. First one is called the NDCs, or Nationally Determined Contributions, meaning every year every country will submit a target on how many emissions they are going to reduce for the future years, along with a target to become net zero. And this is where our discussion on India becoming net zero in 2070, all of these things happened because of these NDCs, or yearly commitments that the countries need to submit. The next thing was called the transparency framework, and this is very much in line with what we are doing today. It means that every year, every country, that 198 countries who have signed up for the UNFCCC agreement, every year they need to calculate and submit what their emissions are from a country perspective. And this is legally binding. That means by law, in signing that agreement, every country has to submit these emission calculations every year. The last one is similar to Kyoto Protocol. The financial contributions are continuing. They have improved on the systems to do it, of course, come from 27 years ago, but the system is still going on. So this Paris is still in effect, and still means that every year countries meet at the COP events and discuss and set targets. Right? So this journey, I hope today after this session are clear on where we started and where we are at Paris right there. Now I'm going to show you a little bit on where we can go from here, right? Now that we are clear on what the discussion actually is around climate change. So the first thing, just to give you some examples, I spoke about these NDCs, nationally determined contributions. Just 4 examples: USA, EU, India and China. So what you can see over here, the first line is the targets to become net zero. So USA has said they will become net zero in 2050, EU has said 2050, India has said 2070, China has said 2060, and this is the date in which they announced that. Similarly, they have also said 2030 targets. So USA, along with saying 2050 they'll become net zero, they've also said that they'll reduce the emissions by 50% in 2030. Similarly, if you see for India, we have committed that by 2030 we will reduce our emissions by 45%. So going a little bit more into India and India's commitments. So relating to these 4 that I spoke about earlier, India had signed up to UNFCCC in 1992, Kyoto Protocol in 2002, Paris Agreement 2016, and relating to the NDCs that we have submitted, India has submitted 2 NDCs. We first submitted our NDC in 2015, right? And the go to the next slide on that actually. So we submitted 2 NDCs. 2015 we actually set a target that we will reduce our emissions by 35%, right, from the 2005 calculation of emissions by 2030. And in a very good news, we actually got very close to that already. So what the initiative was taken was actually we'll revise it. So in 2022 they revised and made the target actually more stronger, that by 2030 we will reduce it by 45%, because we are already doing very well in terms of emission reduction. The next target, not just on emissions but also in sectors, electricity, other sectors, they have committed to have 40% renewable energy in the grid. So in our entire electricity energy system, 40% will come from non-fossil fuel energy. We had increased that from the 2015 to 50%. So I have a question for everyone in the room. Do you think zero emissions is possible? People who think yes, can you raise your right hand? So nobody in the room today believes that zero emission is possible, correct? Okay. But then we keep talking about net zero, right? Can somebody tell me what's the difference between zero emissions and net zero emissions? Between emissions and sequestration. So reducing the amount of CO2 we're putting plus removing some CO2, this plus this will give us a zero, which is net zero. So just for everyone to be clear, there is no discussion that says that we are going to have zero emissions. But there is many discussions on how to become net zero emissions, right? So first thing is how to reduce the emissions that we already are giving out. The second thing is to see how to absorb more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere so that the amount of emissions that we reach, even after reducing, that same amount we need to absorb. So then totally we become zero. Just so that everyone is clear. So any questions so far on any of the topics that I have brought up? So then we move ahead. So just want to cover. This is also something that people talk about, right? There's a lot of discussions. We'll cut the trees here, but we plant it somewhere else, right? We are emitting so much smoke here, but if we plant 1,000 trees here, it's okay, right? So then many people will ask, is that really okay? Just because you're planting trees somewhere else, can you cut trees here? There's a lot of ethical discussion and confusion around the term offsetting. So I'm just going to give you some clarity on where this actually started and why it exists today. So what I covered previously in terms of contribution, exchanging carbon between countries, supporting the carbon reduction of other countries, it was structured in the form of these carbon markets. Basically like a market where you trade carbon. I will make a certificate which is 1 ton of carbon, and I will say this certificate is costing you 10 rupees. So if I have 10 tons, I will sell you 10 certificates. So when we talk about the carbon markets, there is two forms. One is the compliance carbon market. That means based on regulation, if there are governments that say that by law you need to reduce your carbon, and if you don't reduce it, you need to buy these certificates, right? So within that there is a emission trading or cap and trade, which is mainly for companies, and a compliance offset program for countries. So under that we spoke about earlier that Clean Development TDM, which is under the Kyoto Protocol, is for countries to trade, and there is something called the example here, EU emissions trading system. So I'll touch upon both of these. Other one being a voluntary market where a company wants to reduce their emissions, they want to go net zero, not because the government is telling them because of some regulation or anything, they just want to go. They can purchase with voluntary credits. They'll support some project that is planting trees, calculate the carbon, support it, and they'll become net zero. So this is for regulation, that is for voluntary action. So within that, the clean development mechanism that I had mentioned is for countries to act, so countries can trade inter-country and support the sustainable development of other countries, right? So just for reference, in 2023 alone, under these mechanisms of international support for sustainable development, around $420 billion or 3,500 crores has been transferred from the responsible countries who are responsible for climate change to the developing countries who can use this for development activities. This is predicted to go up to 83,000 crores in 2028 alone. So a lot of the NGOs you see that are funded to do these activities, research, etc., are funded by these international funding that is meant for sustainable development. I had mentioned earlier about the EU ETS or EU emission trading system. So this was the first system from a government side that was ever developed for companies to trade carbon. So the system basically said that for every sector, if we take automobile sector for example, we will say that for this year, the whole automobile sector, every company is only allowed to emit so many emissions for their operations, and any company that emits more than that will have to purchase certificates for carbon. where does that certificate come from? It comes from other companies that are below that mark. So what you can see over here, a company that is below that mark can sell that to a company that's above it, and it's sold in the form of these CO2 certificates, right? So this basically incentivizes companies to not just meet the regulatory compliance norms, but to go beyond, because they will get paid for it. If they're installing extra solar or being more energy efficient, they get paid for it, and that money comes from other companies that are not so efficient. So India is also making a system like this, and I will touch upon it. Right? This is the voluntary markets. So what I said, there are a lot of platforms, PlanViewer, Vera, Gold Standard, where you can go and you can buy if you want to. For, let's say, for your department, for example, you want to reduce a certain amount of emissions, you want to offset certain amount of emissions. You have 10 tons that you want to offset by supporting some project that is absorbing it somewhere else. You can go on to any of these platforms, and there are lists of thousands of projects that are happening around the world, where a third party auditor has come and verified that this much carbon has been reduced, and you can purchase those certificates of carbon dioxide certificates. 1 ton of carbon will have a certain price. You can purchase those. So from a private sector perspective, for companies that want to go to net zero quickly, this is the after reducing their emissions as much as possible, for the remaining emissions, this is the approach. So the projects what you can see are in many diverse fields relating to that reduce emissions. So out of the EU ETS, one new and this is a very big discussion that's happening right now, the carbon border adjustment. So what was happening in EU, they had put these caps for all the companies within the EU that they can't increase their emissions more than this. And what was happening, because they had to keep making more efficient technology, putting more renewable energy, what happened is the cost of production for all these companies went up, and then they became less competitive. What also happened is many of the companies started removing their production from EU and producing in China, producing in other parts of the world. So what they realized is, if they apply this cap on emissions only to the companies within EU, then they are losing out on manufacturing within the EU. So they passed a law saying that any company that is manufacturing anywhere in the world and exporting the EU has to still participate and buy these carbon certificates. And this has just happened last year. So for any company that is supplying to an international organization or exporting goods from, and I'll show you the dates, right? From Jan 1st, they will have to calculate their emissions and will have to report it. This is, if they don't report the emissions, the goods will not be allowed inside the EU border, right? Secondly, from 2026 onwards, not just about reporting the emissions, for every ton of carbon that this product that this ship has, they will start taxing. That for each ton of carbon that the product has, we will charge you a tax equivalent to all what the companies are paying within the EU. So this is a big issue, and there's a case being filed from the Indian government at the World Trade Organization about this. Is it allowed or not, right? So what can we do from our side, of course, is to reduce our emissions, firstly. The second thing is, inside this they mentioned, if this EU ETS type system also exists in India, right, and we are having a system for all the companies to also have a cap or a limit on emissions and reduce the emissions, then we don't have to participate in this, we don't have to pay any of these taxes. So in response to this, also just to add that I've given the example of EU because it's already passed, but many other countries, Canada, UK, US, Japan, South Korea, have also proposed similar carbon border adjustment mechanisms. So far from India's side, we have not proposed anything, right? So in line with that, India set up our first carbon trading platform. It's called the Green Credit Program. It is set up under Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Climate Change. It is administered, as you can see here, by the Indian Council of Forestry Research and Education. So this is a voluntary system, meaning that it's not a regulation like a cap and trade like EU ETS. It is a voluntary one where companies can support projects. The projects are mentioned, so forestry, water, agriculture, sustainable agriculture. All these projects will reduce emissions and companies and government departments can purchase these carbon certificates to support these projects in order to become net zero. So this is very relevant from a department perspective. If you are to achieve net zero, the offsetting part will be done through this structure, through this green credit scheme. So this has just been passed, and the structure has been announced, but the market is not yet open. So it is proposed to open in the next 2 years. So at that point, any department can purchase these CO2 certificates from and support different projects through this green credit program. So now, in order to combat this carbon border adjustment, right, there is the EU ETS system that I spoke about. India has set up a similar system. So this is set up under the Ministry of Power. It is called the Carbon Credit Trading Scheme. So this is basically that organizations can trade in carbon, right? But it is based on, I don't know if you are aware, we used to have a PAT scheme before, which is basically that in every sector they will put a limit on what the environmental impact of each type of company can be. Now they're planning to convert this PAT scheme into a carbon based scheme. So it's not based on efficiency, it's based on carbon emissions. Each sector will have a cap, and then companies that are above the cap will have to purchase these certificates from companies that are below, and there will be a price that is fixed. So this is set up and managed going to be administered by Bureau of Energy Efficiency, and they will start this scheme and set up the regulations for each and every sector and set targets. So this is not yet, the targets and all have not yet come out yet. So I just want to tell you, to conclude, a very short story. Some of you all might have heard about this. It's about the frog in water, right? Very simply, if you have a pot where water is boiling and you take a frog and you put it inside that pot, it'll immediately jump out. It'll feel the heat, it'll get burnt and it'll jump out. But the same frog, to take a pot of water that's normal room temperature, put it inside the water and slowly heat up the water. Slowly for 1 hour, slowly increase the temperature. The frog will not move. It doesn't recognize the increase in temperature. It will stay inside the water till it dies, right? And maybe not the best analogy, but in this case, with relation to global warming, we are the frogs. We are sitting here with the temperature warming, and because we don't see outside every day that there is something really happening that is big and drastic and scary, we are ignoring it and not taking it seriously. But slowly, as we warm, we are going to go into a very, very drastic, disastrous scenario. So we need to make sure that even though it is something in the future, even though it's something that we can't see immediately, we still need to take global warming and climate change seriously. And let's try to not be the frog, right? So there is a very good example of this. If you all are aware, around the 80s, they discovered that there was a hole in our ozone layer, right? Our ozone layer is a layer of gases, of ozone gases around our atmosphere that actually protects us from the sun rays. Without that ozone layer, we would immediately get skin cancer. The sun rays would immediately give us skin cancer, right? So that ozone gas was covering the whole earth, and they found in the early 80s that there is a big hole that is formed in this ozone layer, and you can see here it is on the global north above the Antarctic. There is a hole in the ozone, and this hole was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it was going to remove the whole ozone layer from the earth. And there was very clear scientific evidence that this was because of human activities of burning fossil fuels and of releasing certain very powerful chemicals that we use in our air conditioners and our fridge. These are called CFCs and HCFCs, chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons. In our AC, there is a coolant liquid that cools, that is a chlorofluorocarbon. So the chlorofluorocarbons that we used to use before had a very high potential of going into the atmosphere and destroying this ozone, right? So they detected this, and this became public information. Everyone imagined suddenly tomorrow, oh, there's a hole in the sky, and with this hole we are all going to get skin cancer. So everybody around the world came together, right, in what was called the Montreal Protocol, and within 2 years these gases were banned throughout the world, and today you cannot buy these gases anywhere. It is not used for any application anywhere in the world. This was the most successful environmental campaign that has ever happened, and it happened because as a frog they were thrown directly into this hole in the sky, and they recognized, oh, there's a problem immediately, and they acted upon it. So what we 2 points from this: one, that it's possible, we can act on climate change. There has been global movements to act on certain things and change. And the second one being that although ozone was clearly visible to us and we changed because of that, climate change is not directly visible to us, does not mean that we shouldn't act with the same urgency to combat climate change. Just for reference, by 2065 the hole will be closed. Right? Thank you everyone.